Stand by. Is this thing on?
Yes, Dan.
Oh, hello.
You're listening to Old News with Dan and Carrie.
This just in.
Breaking news to report.
We are live.
Old newscasters
Can we just say former?
Sure. Former newscasters reunite behind the mic after more than 20 years.
Old news is good news.
Stay tuned.
Our guest today is Professor Emerita Patty Loew from UW-Madison and the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Dr. Loew was also the inaugural director of the Northwestern Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. In June, she was inducted into the Wisconsin Broadcasting Hall of Fame. Dan and I knew Dr. Loew from WKOW-TV in Madison, Wisconsin in the 90s, and we are honored to have her here today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Carrie. Thanks, Dan.
Hi,
Where
Patty.
you-
It's great to see you.
Yes.
Nice to see you too. You haven't aged a bit.
Well, of course
Where-
not. This is all done with computer graphics.
AI, isn't AI?
Yeah,
what
he's
we call it?
AI generated. Yeah. So where are
Yeah,
you
AI
joining us from right now?
I am joining you from the Hobbit House, which is otherwise known as my home on the east side of Madison. It's partially underground. So it's a bermed house. So
Oh,
kind
cool.
of earth sheltered and thinking about the future and climate change and tornadoes and all those things. So we bought a home that we could feel pretty safe in.
Very
Pretty cool. Do you know how many of those there might be in the Madison area? Because I know there's one out here in Sun Prairie too.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of them. There's one on Old Stock Road, maybe one or two on Old Stock Road, and I know there's some off Highway 14. It's yeah, I think it was kind of a thing that people did in the 80s. I grew up in a housing project in Milwaukee, and I went to public schools. I went to UW La Crosse, changed my major 7 times, and then got my advanced degrees, my master's and doctorate from UW-Madison.
I want to take you back to Milwaukee. So which side of Milwaukee? Were you on the north side of Milwaukee?
North side, yeah, absolutely. Park Lawn
which high
Housing
school
Project.
were you then?
John Marshall.
Which high school? John Marshall.
John Marshall.
Yeah,
I was
okay.
supposed to go to Washington, but Washington was building an addition, and so they were moving all their freshmen, farming them out to other high schools. So I wound up at Marshall.
And then when you got to La Crosse, what did you first go there? You said you changed your major 7 times. What did you start out as?
I started out in Phi-Ed, then went to
Huh.
recreation, then went to speech, English, political science, history, and then mass communication.
So how did
I
you
had
land?
a short but intense attention span.
Yeah, I think like a lot of us in journalism, perhaps. How did you land on journalism then? You said communication was your last one. Was that your inroads into journalism specifically?
It was, and at the end of my junior year, I still didn't have a major. I had all these credits, and I went to a counseling and testing center, and they gave me a battery of tests, and it told me, it concluded I should not be a sewing machine operator, have a religious vocation, or be a life insurance underwriter.
Oh,
And-
okay.
And I said, hey, I gave you $60. You're supposed to tell me what to do with my life. And one of the wise advisors there said, you seem to have this short but intense attention span, and you seem to be interested in everything. What about journalism? And I took, a couple of journalism classes, and that was it. I was absolutely hooked.
I'm sorry, I just can't get the visual out of my head when you said a battery of tests. I see like electrodes tied to your head and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it was really funny because it was those tests that gave you 2 really horrible options at times, and I remember seeing the same question periodically, and so I had enough time at the end that I went back and I changed all my answers to be consistent because they were all over the place. And it came back that I was, super observant, super, consistent, very regimented, and that if anybody knows me, they know that that's not me at all. But I
You're
am
never supposed to change your test
I am
answers.
kind of sneaky.
Yeah. So did you start your journalism career in La Crosse then? Was that your first station that you worked at?
I did. I worked at a campus radio station, WLSU, under news director Paul Lowry, who eventually moved to an AM, a 5,000 watt AM FM station in La Crosse. And I was offered a part-time job, a 15-hour-a-week general assignment job, which I took just to get a foot in the door. Then the resident farm director had a health crisis, and they needed somebody to do farming issues. And again, I think I told you I grew up in a housing project, so I never saw protein that didn't arrive under cellophane, and ate a lot of canned vegetables. So I'd never been to a farm. I knew nothing about farming. And but the radio station was located right across the street from the La Crosse Public Library. So I would race over there and read everything I could read about milk marketing and dairy price supports and the Farm Bill. And I got up to speed pretty quickly.
That's
So
amazing.
you were the La Crosse version of the farm babe that we have
Yeah.
here.
Oh, Pam Yankee.
Pam Yankee.
Oh, she
right.
rocks.
Yeah, she does.
Yeah, she'd be a good guest for you. She's pretty interesting.
Yeah, we got to find her. So I got to ask you, so north side of Milwaukee, like you said, you didn't really have any experience with agriculture, as most people who live in the city don't, unless they just happen to have, a relative or something out on a farm. But you're also a member of the Bad River tribe of Ojibwa. So
Yes.
did you have connection to that? And was that something that kind of informed your reporting at that point?
It didn't inform my reporting at that point.
Okay.
But here I am in the city. There aren't any American Indians in my neighborhood. It was a very diverse, very ethnically and religiously, culturally diverse neighborhood, but there were no Native people. But during the summers, I would go up to the Lakota Reservation where my aunt and uncle lived, and it was always really exciting for me because in my 11-year-old mind, I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to go see Aunt Bunny and Uncle Ace the Indians. And it never really occurred to me that if I had relatives that were Native American, maybe I was too. So it wasn't until I was older in high school and in college, really, because the 60s, I mean, well, I think the two of you probably don't remember the 60s, but it was really an interesting time of civil rights and human rights and, Black power and migrant worker grape boycotts and the women's movement and red power as well. There was a really strong American Indian movement, and I knew nothing about it. So most of what I originally learned, I learned from books. And then in my late teens and early 20s, I began going up to my reservation, reconnecting with culture, meeting relatives for the first time, learning traditions, trying to learn the language, which is difficult when you don't have anybody to speak to. And eventually, I just really felt connected culturally to my relatives in northern Wisconsin.
When did
That's
you
really cool, yeah.
start really researching in terms of journalism? Because you've done so many I mean, it's really parlayed into a central piece of your
Focus.
career. You've written 4 books. One of them is used as a textbook for 20,000 Wisconsin students. And you've done documentaries. When did you, take it more from I'm learning about my history, my family, to I'm going to do research and share with the world?
Well, I think it was the result of my in my late teens and early 20s, going to reservations in northern Wisconsin and learning about some of the social and environmental political issues, and realizing that, we're not learning about these in school. People don't understand tribal sovereignty. They don't understand treaty rights. So it became really important for me to be that sort of cultural navigator and try to find the people who could tell those stories. I've always considered myself a wordsmith and tried to do as little narration as possible and let people tell their own stories. So I had begun doing that in the late 1970s and early 80s. And then you may remember, Dan, we had the huge blow up over tribal spearfishing
Spearfishing,
and
yes.
Ojibwe treaty rights. And so
Yep.
I was in a unique position to really know people who could tell that story and try to tell it in a different way than just interviewing tribal chairs or governors, or to really do more in-depth kinds of reports on the people who were risking their lives. And really it was, I think, obvious to me, and eventually became obvious to most people in the state, that this really wasn't about fish. It was about something much bigger.
And I want to thank you, BB, because when I was a young reporter up in the UP of Michigan, my news director at the time, I had to go cover a spearfishing episode, or a spearfishing episode. It's not fair to say spearfishing,
Yeah.
just to the east of Rhinelander on a lake there that was being harvested, and my news director gave me a documentary you did on spearfishing. I can't remember what it was called. It might have been like Spring of Discontent.
Yeah.
Yes. And I watched that, and here, and I think you'll talk about this later, just about how at that time, at least, I was very uninformed about Indigenous issues or Native American issues in our state or anything like that. So that laid the groundwork for somebody as dopey as me to actually be able to cover it. But remember going there thinking, thank goodness I watched that beforehand, because I had some idea of what I was getting into. And obviously I had seen some coverage and things like that, but that seemed to be really lacking back in the day. I didn't have any education about that at all.
Dan, that really, I really appreciate that. That means a lot to me.
Oh,
I think
you're
that
welcome.
I was already starting to think more about solution journalism. And if you remember from that documentary, I mean, all hell was breaking loose on boat
Yeah.
landings. And the
Yeah.
coverage in both the print and broadcast media was really focused on the conflict. And that
Right.
tends to be what a lot of our coverage and broadcast news is of issues. We tend to focus on conflict and, is there going to be violence tonight? Is anybody going to be hurt? And that documentary allowed me to go out west to Minnesota and then out to Washington State to see how other Indian nations and their states had successfully navigated those waters and were better for it. So
Yeah.
and I was really gratified when after that documentary aired, there was a movement in the legislature to bring the tribes and the DNR together to create cooperative management of, and that's what we have now in the ceded territories. So, solution journalism has always been really important to me, because it's really easy to find issues that are flammable and tear people apart. It's much more difficult to spend the time to come up with solutions that we as a civic society in this democracy we all share can explore.
When you were teaching at UW-Madison and at Northwestern, is that what you tried to instill in your students?
I did. And, my efforts at UW-Madison were really geared towards service learning. And a public institution doesn't have the same resources that a private institution like Northwestern has. At Northwestern, I could take my students to visit communities in Navajo, Hopi, Zuni, Quinault, Quileute. I took my graduate students every year. We spent 8 to 10 days in a tribal community somewhere in the United States. I didn't have that luxury at a public university, but I tried to connect my students to nonprofit groups and Native American nations and Native serving institutions that could benefit from their video production skills. I also would take my undergraduates to the Oneida Reservation every fall to help the White Corn Cooperative bring in their harvest. And it's really an interesting experience. And in my student evaluations, my students always said that not only was the highlight of their class with me, but in their college experience, which was really gratifying. So
Wow.
the Oneida women, the families that have that cooperative, don't sell their corn. They gift it, they barter it, and it takes, and they have to hand harvest it. So my students were learning about food sovereignty, and I would bring them to Oneida. They'd pick thousands of ears of corn and shuck it and braid it and listen to stories and hear the songs and work side by side with tribal members. And in a gift economy, which is very different from the capitalistic society we live in. And it was, there was always a lot of gratitude, and it was just, I think, important to their education. I mean, it was important to my education. I felt like I grew every year.
It sounds like a great experience. And what about the students that you took to some of those other places who were journalism students? Did you see some return on that? Did you see that being successful, and how?
Yes, there were a number of stories that made their way into national publications. The graduate students that I taught, many of them were already professional journalists who came back to Medill for a one-year professional master's degree in a specialization. And the students that were really interested in social justice and environmental justice usually wound up taking my class. But there were stories that were done on, we went to Hopi, for example, and were horrified when we checked into the Hopi Hotel and found out we couldn't drink the water, and learned about how the aquifer had been diminished, partly because of drought conditions, but also perhaps because of the Peabody coal mine reducing the water table and the naturally occurring arsenic. The concentrations grew so heavy because the water had been diminished that the Hopi, who don't have gaming, the only thing they have is their cultural center and their hotel and a little restaurant, they couldn't offer water. And there were signs saying, don't take a shower longer than 2 minutes. So that turned out to be a really good story. That was published in Earther magazine, I think, or maybe it was the Progressive. Anyway, my students found a way to get their stories into national publications, including, the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, as well as national periodicals. And then a surprising number of them wound up either working for a tribal communication outlet or working in a community adjacent and being hired because they understood Native American sovereignty, treaty rights, history.
Right.
So that was really rewarding. I have students who, one of them did a Report for America series that won all kinds of awards on the Columbia Basin. Another one is working in Alaska. I have students in Montana and Colorado. Somebody's interviewing with High Country News. So yeah, it's really gratifying to know that there's a second generation of journalists who are interested in these issues.
Great experience and great education. And I kind of got us off track on. We have to go back to lacrosse quick and find out how you got from lacrosse to Madison, where you then went back to school and kind of enriched your knowledge too of your indigenous roots and just the native tribes in our area. But were you just radio in lacrosse, or were you also TV in lacrosse?
I was working in radio. I was the only electronic reporter who happened to be female, and the FCC came through town, and I don't know what exactly went on, but I got offers from both TV stations the same week, and took the higher paying one, which was $75 a week. And
you were rich.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I didn't have to apply. They just told me to show up on January 1st, 1975 or 6. Anyway, so I show up, and at 5:30 they put a script in my hand and tell me I'm anchoring the news. And I had never been on television before. I had no idea what I was doing. I was really nervous, and so I was just flying through the copy, reading really quickly. And I got to the end, and I had like 45 seconds left and a 15-second story. And I'm
Oh
thinking,
boy.
oh, so I began speaking very slowly. And then I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how do I get out of this? What do I say? And all I could think about was, what does Walter Cronkite do? Because he was a guru back then. He was
Yes.
a man.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm thinking as I'm reading and stumbling because I'm thinking as I'm reading, he shuffles his papers, he leans purposefully into the microphone and he says, and that's the way it is. And, so I got to the end, I shuffled my papers, I leaned purposefully in, I said, and that's the way it is on January 1st, 1975 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And I leaned back and the palms of my hands were sweating so badly that the paper stuck to the bottom of my palm.
Oh
So,
gosh.
yeah, it was an epic fail, my first day on the air.
I was
Did
gonna say, or
anybody say
maybe
anything
it
to you?
stuck.
It was a two-person newsroom, and one of the people, the news director, was fired 6 weeks after I started because it was election night and he dropped the F-bomb twice.
Oh
on air.
my.
So
Oh,
that.
whoops.
Now you can
Yeah.
do that.
You just have to be on cable. It's fine.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Well, when you have one black and white camera and a whole
Yeah.
bunch of numbers that you're trying to, it was
Oh
Right, yeah.
boy.
sad. And back then the FCC was
Yeah.
a lot less forgiving than perhaps
There was some
they are
teeth
now.
to it back then. Yeah. I think most of us
Mhm.
have stories like that though, Patty, who worked in TV, like your first or one of your first on-camera incidents was like that. And then it's the persevering and making sure you can actually maybe get a little bit better. And obviously you got a lot better because then you went from there. And how long were you there before you got to Madison?
Not even a year.
Not even
And
a
then Madison and La Crosse and Wausau the ABC affiliates were connected.
Mhm.
And so they knew about me. And I got offered a job in Madison. And then I was anchoring the 10 o'clock news in Madison. And I think I was the first female evening anchor. There were some women who were hosting morning shows and an afternoon show, but nobody was doing news anchoring. So I think that was the ceiling that I may have broken. And I have to tell you a story. My co-anchor from the 90s, Scott Klug.
Yes.
Yep.
So I was in Scandinavia a couple of weeks ago, and my husband and I went to a sports bar in Copenhagen to watch the Packer game. And I'm next door getting food, and my husband sits down next to a guy and they start talking. I'm from Wisconsin. Where are you from? I live in Monona. Oh, we live 3 minutes from Monona. Oh, have you always lived there? No, we just moved from Chicago. What were you doing in Chicago? Oh, my wife was a professor of journalism. Oh, she was a professor at Northwestern. Oh, what department was she in? Journalism. David Braga. It was Scott Klug.
My gosh.
Of all the
Oh
people.
my
And then I
gosh.
come in.
How long had it been since you'd seen him?
That's
probably
crazy.
15, 20 years maybe. It was
And
just
there
crazy.
you are in Copenhagen. Yeah.
It was crazy. And then 2 days later, I have to tell you, I'm in Oslo and our server notices we're speaking English and asks where we're from. And we said Wisconsin. And she said, oh, I have family in Green Bay. My great uncle was a Green Bay Packer. And we said, really? What was his name? Ray Nitschke.
Oh no.
So
you are making
was-
this
What
up,
a
Patty.
yeah, it was kind of a
world.
crazy
That is
crazy
awesome.
trip.
That is crazy. Wow. So how long
That's
were you at
worth the trip.
WKOW?
I was there from 75 to 79 and 85 to 99. And then in between that, alongside working in commercial television, I redeemed myself in public television beginning in 1990 or 1991. And then I worked at PBS Wisconsin until 2011.
Were you working at both PBS and
Yeah.
KOW for a bit there.
Yeah, I was doing that Judy Woodruff thing where you work
Yeah.
for
She's everywhere.
work for PBS and a commercial station. And I was a teaching assistant and writing my dissertation and going to taking graduate classes.
Oh
And
my gosh.
there was like a neutron bomb went off in my brain, and my exterior was intact, but inside I was just this protoplasmic gelatinous goo.
That's a
I
lot.
seem to remember, I seem to remember when at least when I first got to the station, you were still anchoring, but you were also doing special projects. And yeah, I mean, I remember you couldn't hardly talk to you because you were always so busy, and then you were off doing something else. And then I think you
Oh,
did
and I
a
also I had
documentary.
2 kids in that
Yeah, and
in
your
that case.
kids.
Oh,
Right.
children.
Yeah. Oh, and those.
Oh,
And you,
what were
I
their
think I
names again?
remember dipping into some of your documentary footage many times. I think it was called No Words for Goodbye or something like that,
Mhm.
using that a couple of times. But yeah, that had to be crazy for you, Patty. But you must have really had a goal and been driven to kind of move into the next step of your career then.
No, I always thought that people that did should teach. I know that if we all went to school for journalism or media, and we had professors who have never been in the business, and when everything is theoretical, it just isn't relevant. You know, there were theories that I was learning and being polite, but thinking, you know, I will I have never come across that theory in the real world, and it'll never be relevant. And
Right.
so, and it's not that I don't appreciate communication theory. I mean, I'm a scholar, so you know, there's some things that are really important, but there's a lot of I just find that learning by doing is really helpful. And so the professors like Jim Hoyt, for example, who I know you've had on your show,
Yes.
you know, being able to learn from someone like him who really, you know, knows documentaries and documentary production was really helpful for me.
Yeah, speaking of, you've done several documentaries, including Way of the Warrior, that I actually still, you can watch it today on PBS, and I'll put a link in our show notes.
Oh,
Can you
thank
tell
you.
us about making that documentary, what led you to do it, you know, what planted the seed for that topic?
Ogechida. I was born in war, WW2. Listened as the old men told stories of getting gassed in the trenches, WW1. Saw my uncles come back from Guadalcanal, North Africa, and the Battle of the Bulge.
Native Americans have one of the highest military enlistment rates in the country. Some might find that ironic, given their historic mistreatment. They serve for the same reasons other Americans serve, out of patriotism, for economic reasons, opportunity. But there's another layer that's uniquely cultural.
My grandfather, Edward Denomi, is one of the veterans you're about to meet.
Yeah, you know, well, my grandfather was one of 25,000 Native Americans who were sort of plucked out of Indian boarding schools, and their experience there in those schools was very militaristic. They marched to the dining hall, they marched to their classes, they marched to their dormitories, and they drilled every morning at 5 o'clock with little, you know, wooden rifles. So they were good little soldiers when they were already good little soldiers when World War I broke out. And my grandfather had joined the National Guard because it paid $1 a month or $2 a month, something like that, and actually was deployed to the Mexican border to fight Pancho Villa.
Whoa.
I know, but he said he never saw him. They hung around the fort and ate oranges, which was a real delicacy for him. And he learned how to play the German. He was with a bunch of German American soldiers, and they learned how to play sheep's head. So, which is a good Wisconsin.
It's a good skill in
game.
Wisconsin, right? Yeah.
But you know, I always imagined him standing there with his hand up, you know, pledging to protect the Constitution. And you know, he wasn't even a citizen. And I always thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to understand why he would do that. And then as I explored that topic a little bit, Native Americans enlist in the military more than any other group per capita. And they also are highly decorated. They serve in disproportionate numbers. And the reasons why Western historians have supposed, why that is, was not what I was hearing from veterans themselves. I remember going to a powwow in Chicago and talking to a Menominee vet. And now at that time, this was like maybe 15, 20 years ago, 78% of all eligible men on the Menominee Reservation were in either active or reserve duty. I mean,
Really?
astonishing numbers. Yeah.
Wow. Bless you.
And I'm talking to this Menominee vet, and I said, so, he told me that he served in Vietnam. And I said, so did you have a high draft number? And he said, no, I enlisted. And I said, why would you do that? And he said, well, because my tribe signed a peace and friendship treaty with the U.S. government in 1828. And we promised to come to the assistance of the country should it ever need us. And even though the U.S. has broken every treaty it ever signed with my nation, we're still honoring our obligations. And I went, okay, I have to do a documentary about this.
Yeah.
So it was interesting because I didn't intend to tell my grandfather's story, but it was like he had a hand on my shoulder. And at everywhere I turned, I'm in the State Historical Society, I find film from 1916 when his National Guard unit is training at Camp Douglas with bayonets and just really interesting stuff. A cousin gives me a roll of film. He took a camera to the Mexican border with him and took pictures. And they're unlike, if you see most World War I pictures, it's doughboys in front of like a Sears background, And my grandfather took pictures of men, waiting outside the chow line and showing holes in their boots. And one picture that still is chilling to me, where they've posed, it's clear they're playing at war. There's a guy in the middle on his knees and he's going, and there are men around him with their rifles pointed. And 2 months later, half of them are probably dead, because they're in France and they served in all 7 major battles. And then another cousin gave me a diary that my grandfather kept at the front. So, he was really articulate in his writing and perfect penmanship, which is really interesting. But
That's a lost art.
describing German bombings and how his best friend died from shrapnel, and it was just really, really gripping. And I really felt compelled to tell his story. And I spent a lot of time in Oklahoma talking to a number of men who had been awarded the Medal of Honor for amazing, incredibly dangerous, heroic activities in World War II. Korea, which was a really fascinating story because there's a Ho-Chunk soldier who is highly decorated, who received the Medal of Honor for sacrificing himself in Uijeonbu, Korea. And his cousin was killed the same week. And they had completely different experiences. Red Cloud wound up with a battleship named after him. They renamed Camp Uijeonbu Camp Red Cloud. He has a park and schools named after him. And John Rice, his cousin, who was killed the same week, it took a year for his body to be returned. And then they've had the funeral. The body is above the open grave. And the funeral director, or the cemetery director, remarks to the funeral director, gee, there sure are a lot of Indians here. And the funeral director said, well, yeah, Sergeant Rice, he's an Army hero. And the cemetery director says, no, he can't be buried here. This is a whites only cemetery. So I thought that was a really interesting, two dichotomous kind of stories to tell, which
Yeah.
really describes the 50s pretty well in
Mm.
America. And then Vietnam, a combat veteran who experienced tremendous PTSD and sort of found his way through poetry. So it was a
Mm.
really, it was an important documentary for me to do, and it was, I still kind of get chills when I watch it.
Mm.
Did you know your grandpa as you know,
Oh
as an
yeah, he
older
lived with
man?
us.
You knew your
He lived
grandpa.
with us
He
for a
lived with
while.
you. Okay.
Oh,
And so
really?
what was it like for you to go back? I mean, first of all, to see film of your grandpa in training and then those pictures. What was that like for you? And then what was it like reading his diary? I mean, did that make you feel that much more connected to him? That's just crazy to me to be able to
Yeah.
read something that my
It
grandpa
did.
wrote.
You know, one of the interesting things that happened was in 2016, France, this is when World War I began in France. And so I was contacted by French public TV to consult on a film that they were doing on Native American soldiers and the contribution they made in World War I. And in an effort to be helpful, I sent them an electronic copy of my grandfather's diary, thinking, well, this will give them a really, intimate look at the experience of an American Native GI. And they called me back and said, your grandfather's diary is just mind blowing, and we want to tell his story. So I met them. They paired me with a hyper local historian who took me to all the places that my grandfather had described in the diary, and it was
Fantastic.
so specialized and individualized. I mean, we were in one village, and he said, see that church there, that steeple, there was a German sniper up there, and your grandfather's unit was coming, his unit was coming right beyond that stone wall there, and it was, I was there, and
Jeez. That does give you goosebumps.
Yeah, sure
it
does.
did. And the last place they took me was to Bellewood, which is an American cemetery. And most of the casualties of the 32nd Red Arrow Division, which was my grandfather's division, are buried there. And they asked me to walk, and it looks like Arlington, where there's just white crosses for as far as you can see, the occasional Jewish star. And I am looking at all the surnames of Native Americans from around the state of Wisconsin, because this is the research that I've done. So I know that Dox-Taters and Metoxins are from Oneida, and Morrisons and Kings are from Bad River, and Ishams are from Le Coudray, and I'm seeing all these names in this cemetery, and I realize, they may not have ever had a family member come there, because this is in the 1920s, when a lot of Native people here in Wisconsin didn't speak English. They didn't, we don't have the communication that we have now. And I had this overwhelming kind of need to, lay hands on some of these graves and just witness. And that whole experience was, I think, intensified because I was with my 20-year-old son,
Oh yeah.
who was the same age as my grandfather was when he was over there. And I couldn't imagine my son being in that kind of situation and experiencing that kind of horror and trauma. And,
Yeah.
and that was a horrible war. I mean, that's the first time that you had tanks and planes and machine guns and gas
Mustard
and
gas,
chlorine
yeah.
and just awful. So yeah, that remains a really important project for me.
Yeah.
I'm going to watch that now.
Right.
Remind people it is The Way of the Warrior.
Streaming on
And it's
PBS
still
Wisconsin.
streaming on PBS Wisconsin.
I
Good.
just clicked
At
on
no
it today.
charge. It's free.
And no charge.
Got the distribution rights back from Vision Maker.
Ooh, Oh, very
Nice.
good. Well, we will be sure to put that on. Now, tomorrow night, now what this will be airing a few weeks after you actually do this presentation. I'm looking for it here because I jotted this down. You're doing a presentation at the Aldo Leopold Center. Can you tell us about what you're going to be talking about? And actually, with your permission, I'll put it on our social media today, so at least people could sign up today or tomorrow and attend.
Well, the presentation is entitled Ajijak, which is our word, Ojibwe word for sandhill crane. And the crane, it's, I think the crane, the month of the crane, or National Crane Remembrance Month. I'm not sure. But we're all supposed to
You
be
you can say
thinking
anything, we'll
about
believe
and
you.
being
Yes.
grateful for sandhill cranes, and we should, because they're
Yeah.
wonderful animals.
Hmm.
And for us, they're really culturally significant because they're a clan animal for us. And our leaders, our peace chiefs and negotiators and diplomats came from the Crane clan. And so we think about that animal, which stands above the water and looks out. And so in our clan structure, the crane handles outside negotiations and strategies and diplomacies. The loon, which is my clan, also produces leaders, but because we're inside the water, our role in Ojibwe society is to settle disputes and handle things within the community, lead in that way. So there's a lot that I have to say about cranes and the role they play in our environment, and they're kind of a metaphor for what anybody who is thinking about climate change and sustainability ought to be thinking about, in my humble opinion. And so I'm going to be sharing my knowledge of Ajijak with people at who have signed up for this seminar at the Aldo Leopold Foundation.
And there's
That sounds
already
cool.
a lot of comments. Like I was looking at, once you register, you can comment, and there's a lot of comments and interaction happening before this talk is even happening. What do you think is attracting so much attention to it?
Well, I mean, it's migration season, so people are seeing a lot of sandhill cranes. In Madison, there are cranes everywhere. I swim a couple of times at the couple of times a week at the East Side YMCA, and there are always sandhill cranes just hanging around the front door of the YMCA. And there's a guy across the street that's hand feeding some. They're stopping traffic on Cottage Grove Road, and so I think we're seeing a lot more sandhill cranes. I also think there's been talk of opening up a hunting season on them, so I think there's that's attracting some interest and division. And Ojibwe people we love our cranes. And we have the International Crane Foundation just north of us in Baraboo. And that has been such a success story. I think 30 or 40 years ago, there were maybe a dozen nesting pairs of cranes.
Yeah, I
And
remember that.
that foundation has single-handedly brought that population back from the brink. And the story, if there's a really lovely documentary called Raising Crane about whooping cranes that was done in conjunction with PBS Wisconsin many years ago, where they were having sandhill cranes raise the whooper eggs, and then when the whoopers got to a certain age, because birds imprint on the first thing they see, they have to be really careful. So George Archibald, who is the director of the International Crane Foundation, would put on this big white puppet outfit, and they would feed them, with these big white puppet,
I remember those. Yeah.
puppet arms, and then got them to follow an ultralight and migrate, I think, to Texas or
Yeah, south,
Nebraska, or
somewhere,
Texas,
right, yeah.
someplace south.
Yeah.
And it worked, and they came back. So
Incredible.
documentaries are really powerful,
Love them.
wonderful, lovely,
So
intoxicating media projects.
Yeah.
again, I'm still noodling on something you said before, two things you said before, so I'm going to go back to it. You said you were from the clan of the Loon, the Loon clan, and you were more, I mean, the Loon were supposed to do more negotiation. What if you were not good at that? Could you be traded to the Stark, to the Crane?
They trade me to the Ho-Chunk or the Monarch.
Right, yeah.
Loan you out for a while.
No, I think, it is kind of interesting though, because loons are supposed to be communicators. I mean, that's our role.
Well,
And
they
we're
do are.
supposed
Listen
to
to them
be
all the time up north.
ambassadors. And it's interesting and sort of culturally consistent that's what I sort of fell into in
Totally.
in my life. I don't know. I come from a really I come from a family of big personalities. So my mother's native family is just a big, loving, sloppy family where everybody knows everybody, everybody's business, and you know, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. But as a journalist, I eschew that,
Right.
Right, yeah.
Save
do
that
in
for after
facts.
hours. Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So I think, my family were such big mouths that there wasn't anything else I was ever going to do except,
Be a
find
communicator.
find a role in communication somehow.
So then the other thing you said was you redeemed yourself when you worked for public television. And I'm just curious, what makes you say you redeemed yourself?
Redeemed myself.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be really honest. In the early 1990s, broadcast television really began to change. And I think it was the penetration of cable and satellite, and commercial stations were getting less and less of the pie, and turning to television news consultants, and news got really homogenized during that period where some reporter in Poughkeepsie got in a car with a universal garage door opener and pressed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to see how many garage doors they could open, and Carol in the suburbs, details at 10. And
we all did that series.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know I've seen it.
Everybody did that series all across America, and the opening music, the music stings, and the red, white, and blue rolling, tumbling boxes, and the anchor turn and smile, all of that, and the video news services, where all of a sudden you were having news sponsored by investment companies, your Eye on Money sponsored by fill in the blank, and your favorite investment company here. And it was specialized it appealed to a very special segment of society. You never saw what you saw was Roth IRAs and zero balance budgeting. You never saw what to do when you got the third notice on your eviction notice, or how to navigate section 9, section 10 housing. And the same thing, with health reports. And to me, it was a really sad precursor. It was a sad precursor to what has happened with commercial television, with its emphasis more on infotainment than information. And then now look at newspapers. I mean, it's the same thing. I think journalism, the whole landscape has shifted, and it's to me, it's just really sad because,
Right.
I truly believe that journalism is tied to democracy, and we need strong journalism in order to have and maintain a strong democracy. So it was really discouraging to me to see the trends in local news, and shifting to PBS. There weren't those same pressures, and it wasn't, PBS wasn't going to go away, and it wasn't dependent on ratings the way commercial television stations were.
Mm-hmm. And
Do you think
did,
PBS faces some of those same challenges now, though, that commercial television faced back in the 90s? Because things have, the landscape has changed a little bit
Yeah,
too
it has.
for public television news.
Yeah, I think they're, well, I was just talking about PBS programming in general, because I worked on a news
Yeah,
and public affairs program and
right.
didn't do a nightly newscast there. But having that, I mean, the mission of PBS is to be a space for those stories that aren't going to find their way onto commercial television stations. So
Mhm.
that hasn't changed. And so you can look at a program like Here and Now, or and there's an emphasis on political news, where in a commercial television station, remember we used to call it BOPSA, boring old people standing around. You can't go
Right.
and do a
Right.
political story.
Right.
You have to find a feature, you feature somebody who's affected by that story.
Mhm.
Well, they can still have politicos on and interview legislators and governors and things on PBS, and people expect that from them,
Right.
where they might
Right.
get a little impatient if they see those kinds of in-depth interviews in a commercial news context.
something you had said, and I think it was a PBS interview that I had read online. You were talking about the opportunity to work with Dave Iverson, and that together, the quote was, you had created a really good environment for civil discussions, and that,
Yeah.
you wonder if we're ever going to be able to just sit all sides together calmly and have a discussion. Can you just tell us about what you did then and how we could possibly, any thoughts on
Yeah.
how we could possibly get back there?
Yeah, that was the thing that I think it was probably one of the highlights when I look back on my career. I'm really proud of the space that we created in that program. Um, we covered news and public affairs, and then at the end of the show, we would have this political roundtable. And one week it would be two Dems and a Republican, and the next week it would be two Republicans and a Democrat. And the role that Dave and I played was to throw a an issue bone on the table and let them gnaw on it for a while, and then pull it off and throw another bone on the table. But the discussions were energetic, but they were always really respectful. And afterwards, we may or may not have gone out and had an adult beverage together. And there was mutual respect and a certain civility that, doesn't seem to exist these days. And I really miss that. And I think that that's, if I hope for anything in the future for commercial and public television, I think it's to create those kinds of spaces where people who have different views can come together and have those civil discussions that are respectful, good arguments, but at the end of the day, people shake hands and leave with an appreciation for the opportunity to sit down and share opposite views.
Good advice for life in general.
Right.
Absolutely.
Not just TV.
Right.
Yeah.
Politics,
it's something we
TV,
all
life.
need to get back to. Correct. I agree. And I do appreciate watching news on it. My wife and I, that's kind of what we watch all the time, is NPR now. And I do appreciate that they still do have opposing viewpoints on, and it usually is done very civilly. And I do think that's an important contribution to the information that's out there. Because I get frustrated when I watch local TV now, and I get frustrated. There's so much going on sometimes, and the older you get, the less you can hang on to that stuff. So I completely
With the
understand what you're
tumbling
saying.
boxes and the fonts and the rolling.
Yeah, it's like,
George
what did that
Stimulus.
say? Yeah, what did that say? And then you're looking at your phone at the
And
same
we
time.
got
right?
trid to the Cleveland
Right.
Cavaliers.
Yeah, exactly. Then, how long you were at PBS or Wisconsin Public Television there for about 10 years.
2011. Yep.
Yeah. And then you were also
20
teaching
years.
at the
Yep.
same time, 20
Yep.
years. You were teaching at the same time, and then you stopped working there, but you still continued to teach at UW.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yep.
I thought, had you planned to retire and be done at UW, and then, you just kind of got pulled back in, or what?
Well, the other thing that was going on was I was lucky enough to get a wonderful grant from the Mortgage Foundation at UW to do tribal youth media workshops. And so for
Okay.
20 years, from 2005 on, I would go to reservations in northern Wisconsin and teach tribal teenagers how to do video production. And they would create stories. And the whole point was to try to connect storytelling with land stewardship. That was a really important project to me. And in 2015 and 2016, the landscape changed, and the UW's budget, the UW system budget, was cut by $350 million. And the first thing to go in that scenario is outreach. I mean, because deans have to keep the lights on, and that's what my dean told me. And so I thought, I'm 65. This is maybe a good time for me to retire. Well, then,
And
well, there was a dean at Medill who every couple of years would come to me and say, you really ought to be at Medill. Maybe you should just, why don't you just be a visiting professor for, a quarter and see how you like it? And I thought, and he called, right at the right time. So it seemed like it was sort of providential, serendipitous.
Yes.
And
Right.
so I went there to teach, and they were grappling with a really tragic anniversary where the founder of Northwestern and Evanston, the city of Evanston, was a man by the name of John Evans, who was the governor of Colorado and may or may not, depending on which historical record you read, have been the principal architect of the Sand Creek Massacre. So Northwestern was in a serious atoning mode, and they had successfully gotten a Mellon grant to create a Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. And they asked if I would advise them on how to create something like that. And that was a role that I had just played for UW for the system through the Nelson Institute and the School of Human Ecology, creating a tribal summit with the 12 Native Nation leaders and researchers here at UW. And so, I conducted listening sessions around the state. So those experiences were really helpful as I helped Northwestern create the center. And then they said, well, would you consider, just being the director for a year just to get us off the ground?
Famous last
just
words.
a year,
7 years
just a
later.
little bit.
Right.
So 7 years later, I finally was able to retire. After giving them every year, I'm giving them resumes and CVs of people that, I thought would be perfect directors. But it was a really great experience. And as it turned, and Medill was gracious enough to continue funding the tribal youth media projects. And we were really fortunate to put together a number of grants that in the end, really, I was able to do more outreach in Wisconsin Native American communities from Illinois than I ever was in Wisconsin. So it worked out all the way around, I think.
Sure did. And how did you feel when you were inducted into the Wisconsin Broadcasting Association Hall of Fame over the summer?
Stunned.
Really?
Because well, I was in the same class as Matt LePay, who I've been such a fangirl of his forever. And there are people in there that I have really admired. And so it felt like, I don't know, I felt a little bit like an imposter. Like, do I really belong with these cool people? But it was a really wonderful experience. And the staff and members of the Wisconsin Broadcasting Association were so gracious and kind, and yeah, it was like taking a bath in sunlight.
Ah, that's so cool.
I
Well,
like that. Well
congratulations.
deserved
Yeah.
too.
Yes,
Congratulations. You are
absolutely.
definitely not an imposter.
No
Um,
way.
Carrie mentioned before that you've authored some books, including, curriculum for students in schools. Are you working on anything right now, documentary or literature, that is going to be coming out soon?
Oh, well, how nice of you to ask me about that. I've just agreed to write a third edition of Indian Nations of Wisconsin.
Oh.
And so I'll be, the last one came out well, about 10 or 11 years ago. So there's 10 more years of history to add. So I'll be, over the next year, we're hoping to have it come out on Indigenous Peoples Day, October 2026. So
Cool.
over the next year and a half, I'll be traveling throughout the state and reading a lot of tribal newspapers and talking to. That's always my first stop, is to talk to the tribal journalists and read their newspapers, and then that gives me a sense of, who else I need to talk to and what I need to include in the book. So I'm looking
And
forward
that
to
will
that.
and that will be used in schools again, along with the teacher's guide, or?
Well, that's I used to say my adult book, but it made me feel
Oh.
whenever I say
Yeah, not a good thing to say.
swinging my
Right.
bag of quarters on King Street, right? So
Especially for a UW lacrosse grad, right? No, I'm kidding.
that's the general interest history book that basically got appropriated by Native Studies teachers at the
Got
college and high school level. And that's the book
Okay.
they use. And that's the book that was really written for a general audience. The fourth grade reader, which is Native People of Wisconsin,
Oh, okay.
that's the smaller book that's used by, well, all the fourth graders that are adhere in schools that adhere to Act 31, which is
Right.
you have to learn
curriculum.
about Wisconsin Indian history, treaty rights, sovereignty 3 times in the K-12
Right.
experience, and it
Hmm.
sets up teacher certification standards. So that's the book that's used in those classrooms, along with a teacher's guide.
Got it.
And usually what happens is, after the newest edition of the general history book comes out, then usually we start a kid's version of that book a year or two later.
What a great resource. Again, something we never had when I was a kid. I didn't, like you, I learned about the Native people from, unfortunately, movies and, TV series and things like that. So I think the first, everybody talks about this one, but the commercial that stands out in my mind is the one where the Native American man is looking out over a mountain
The
of
crying
trash and
Indian.
the tear comes down,
Right.
right? And that
And
was
he
kind of like my
wasn't
first.
he wasn't Indian, he was Italian.
Right, he wasn't even right. I know.
Which tells
I
you
know.
yeah.
I
But
know.
when I look back at my career, I mentioned that Way of the Warrior really stands out as something I'm very proud of. But the thing that I think is probably the most important thing I've ever done in my career is that fourth grade reader. Because now, I mean, that first one came out 25 years ago, I think. And now
Yeah.
those fourth graders are doctors, lawyers, teachers, senators, congressional representatives. And, to think that maybe they have a more authentic, realistic view of Native people, because, all the books that I write are written collaboratively with people in those communities, and they're the ones that are they're reading, they're editing, and they're giving their final approval to the work that's done. So I feel really good about those books, and the fact that there's a generation of young adults now, and more coming up, that are maybe going to think about Native people differently than the way Americans did until just recently.
Right. It's great. It's fantastic.
Yes.
Well, we don't want to keep you all day here because it's
We
been more
could,
than an
though.
hour now. We could, because I'm sure you have many more stories.
The topics will
Um,
never end.
I just want to ask you, I ask everybody this, I call it my first, worst, and thirst question. What was your first job ever? What was your worst job ever? And is there something you're still thirsting to do, Patty?
Okay. First job was I was a singing waitress in a German supper club in Milwaukee. And
No
I
way.
sang, I was accompanied by a 91-year-old zither player and learned all the German drinking songs by rote. I have no idea what I was singing, but I learned the syllables.
Please give us a
Fantastic.
little sample, just a little.
Ah, really?
Achte lieber
Yes.
Augustine.
Du liegst mir im Herzen, du liegst mir im Sinn. Okay, that's it.
Yeah,
That
great.
is awesome.
Weiß nicht, wie gut ich dir bin.
So was that Carl
was,
Roch's or Mater's or
that was at the
the
Golden Zither.
the Golden Zither? Okay.
Yes, on the north side.
Outstanding.
Worst job was checking feet at a public swimming pool when I was
Oh,
Oh.
good grief.
Yeah.
Like for fungus or wounds or what?
Yep, you got it. If you
All
had
of the
Oh.
above.
or some kind of
Oh,
nasty toe jam, you were coming in that waiting
you,
pool.
you were the toe jam police. Okay.
Yeah. And I thought, I mean, I've proudly worn that because when people say, what's the worst job you ever had? I mean, it's hard to top that, right?
Oh,
It
somebody
is.
actually
I'm a
did.
little nauseous thinking about it, honestly.
You got me beat for sure. Yeah.
But somebody actually did. So, I don't have that. I can't wear that medal anymore. And thirst. I think travel. I was in between Madison, leaving in 79 and coming back in 85. I was a travel reporter out west, and I went all over the world, and I absolutely love travel. And so I'd like to sort of channel my inner Anthony Bourdain and travel the world and learn how to cook, culinary dishes from all over the world.
And maybe you'll run into Paul Pittis or Ken Syke when you're over there. Some
In
other TV
Copenhagen
guy.
at a Packer bar.
Yeah. At a Packer bar.
Right. And then Scott Klug pulls up. You just never know what will happen. Well, and I always like to ask our guests about any bloopers, on-air bloopers. I know you shared a pretty darn good one with the Walter Cronkite lean in
yeah.
and the
And
but
that's
any
the way it
others?
There's
Any
one
others?
I can't really say. I can't say. Well, they weren't my bloopers,
Right.
but
You
I
were
was
sitting next to some
acting news
bloopers.
director at the time, and
Oh.
there was somebody who did a tease, the NAACP swimming and diving championships. That was instead of the NCAA.
Oh my.
Took me a second. I was like,
I
oh,
did
yeah.
too. I was like seeing the letters in my mind. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
so thinking about Malcolm X and John Lewis, doing triple dives off the 20-meter.
That's good
high dive.
trouble.
Triple Indy.
Yeah, that was pretty bad.
That's good stuff.
Well,
Very
Patty,
good.
thank you so much for talking with us today. I mean,
Yes.
again, we could do 5 episodes with you, and
Absolutely.
I think people would love to hear all of the things that you've done. I was looking at your curriculum vitae, and I was like, oh my gosh, I've done nothing in my entire life compared to what Patty Loew has done. So
No,
thanks for
you are
sharing.
amazing.
Oh,
Yes,
you
thank
bet.
you so
It was a
much.
pleasure to talk to both of you. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks.
Thank
And
you
we'll
for
see you
being
next
here.
time. We'll see you
Bye.
next time on Old News with Dan and Carrie. See ya.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Old News with Dan and Carrie.
That's old news for now.
Join us next time.